By the rivers of Babylon, as I lay crying, I remember Zion. For the wicked carried us away, captivity required of us a song. How can we sing of liberty in a strange land? The psalm, By the Rivers of Babylon. That is our topic for today. Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps over the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Yes, indeed. Imagine, if you will, being taken by force from your home and carried away to a strange land where you don't speak the language. There you are beaten and scourged, stripped of your dignity, sold at auction to the highest bidder. Then you are made to labor all the days of your life alongside the mules and other beasts of burden for the enrichment of your captors. And then, as if this isn't bad enough, they also want you to entertain them with song and dance. Does any of this sound familiar? That's precisely what happened to my ancestors as they were spit out from the bellies of slave ships called the Jesus, the Angel, the Grace of God. Yes, those were actual names of the slave ships. They were spit out onto the shores of the New World, whereas the Rastafarians of Jamaica still call it Babylon, a name that's more appropriate than we may realize at first. Yes, many people have identified with the 137th Psalm as symbolic, representing not only the circumstances of the Jews in Babylon about 2,600 years ago, but also the plight of all enslaved and oppressed peoples everywhere. Carried away from their homeland after having their nation defeated and humiliated, their holy temple, the center of their religion, demolished, the Jews of that era captured in this psalm some of the very sentiments shared by so many throughout the ages. For the majority of us, when we hear the word Babylon, certain images might come to mind of a faraway, long-ago place. Some of us recall having seen pictures or descriptions of the hanging gardens of Nebuchadnezzar, or the sculpted bulls with wings that graced so many of their buildings. Some may recall Babylon to be the place where Hammurabi first codified a set of written laws to govern a civilization. Our history books describe Babylon as a great and sophisticated civilization, built and made strong by commerce and trade. It was one of the early cradles of civilization. Babylon was a mighty nation, and even by its standards, a religious nation. Its name means gateway to God. It was in many ways a most advanced and enlightened society. Yet, it was also a society in which the power of death reigned. Its armies were mighty in battle, and they maintained order and stability throughout the Middle East of their time. It was a power to be reckoned with. Its economy was strong, and many nations sought to enrich themselves through trade with her. If you're familiar with the biblical description of Babylon, you may recall that from the perspective of the Hebrews, it was also a place of horrible injustice and slavery. It was seen as a great nation that destroyed, squandered, and devoured human life for the sake of their own enrichment and power. Babylon considered itself to be specially blessed by its gods, and considered itself to be deserving of supremacy among nations, fully entitled to do unto them as she deemed fit. Babylon was enriched by the labor of foreign slaves brought from afar to toil for the benefit of their masters. Perhaps even worse, the people of Babylon partook of the supreme idolatry, the worship of themselves in the form of the ideal state, considering themselves to be uniquely destined for continual supremacy over everyone else. Babylon therefore serves not only as a reminder of a particular time and place, but as a metaphor for any nation governed by the powers of death and oppression. Babylon is a symbol of any nation that sets itself up as an idol and places its own material interests above those of all others, claiming its supremacy as the epitome of civilization and relegating all others to subservient roles. History records that there have been any number of such civilizations and nations, all of which dramatically fell from their place of prominence, only to be replaced by another. Among these we may list the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Turks, the British Empire. Each of these civilizations at its peak considered itself to be the embodiment of all that was modern and was expected to last forever in its supremacy. This pattern has been repeated any number of times in the historical record, and should serve as a reminder that such societies may flourish for a time, but inevitably fall victim to their own sense of superiority and entitlement. In short, they start to believe their own mythology, sowing the seeds of their eventual downfall. Nothing lives forever, not even nations. What does seemingly live forever is the tendency for people to forget the basis upon which true greatness lies. What does last forever is the folly of following the voices of zealous nationalism while ignoring the prophetic calls for realism and justice, forgetting that those who are most sure of their own righteousness are often the most wrong of them all. But what does this have to do with the psalm? Well, some historical background is in order. We might ask as we read the psalm, just how did the Hebrews come to be in Babylon in the first place? We may recall that Israel was also a nation that believed itself to be specially blessed by God, a nation that was under the special protection from God. It was their belief that God had chosen them for a special mission and that He, Yahweh, would be their king and defender. They had engaged in aggressive wars of conquest led by Joshua. They had slaughtered the inhabitants of Canaan so that they could fulfill their own manifest destiny. It was a part of their ideology that in times of emergency, God would always raise up some charismatic leader who would lead them into battle and would always be victorious no matter what the odds. Their passionate commitment to the national mission matched that of their God, Yahweh. He was called Yahweh Sabaoth, or the Lord of Hosts. And that included both the army of Israel and the angelic warriors who contended mysteriously on their behalf. They were assured of victory because they were the righteous ones, contending against absolute evil in the form of whatever group stood in their way. Of course, this implicit belief that they would always win was a recipe for disaster. Despite the warnings of the prophets, especially Amos, that God's justice worked impartially among nations, and that Israel had herself engaged in the same sort of war crimes for which other nations had been destroyed, they persisted in their reliance upon their own certainty that they were in the right. Amos was banned from the kingdom as a subversive, his criticisms ignored. Meanwhile, Israel was falling apart from within. The court system became corrupt and inefficient because a nation that believes itself believes that it can rid the world of evil by killing its enemies, no longer comprehends the need for the slow processes of law. Because religion had degenerated into a means to guarantee success and power, the chosen people had lost touch with the vitality and stability that came from adherence to a faith that led them to do justice and to walk humbly before God. Destruction was inevitable. Therefore, when they confronted Assyria, certain that Yahweh would protect them and guarantee victory, the northern kingdom was defeated and broken up, finally disappearing with the fall of Samaria in 721 BC. The reliance on their zealous nationalism had been suicidal. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, another prophet, Isaiah, also knew that God did not play favorites. The king, relying on anti-Assyrian alliances and on new military weaponry, ignored Isaiah's warnings, instead heeding the advice of religious leaders who claimed that the northern kingdom's defeat had been due to their failure to properly follow all the rules of ritual purity, marking them as special, pure, and chosen. Isaiah had said that God would, quote, put an end to the pride of the arrogant and lay low the haughtiness of the ruthless. Surely, this did not mean them. The devastating Assyrian invasion shattered their illusions of invincibility, leading some to believe that there was no real purpose for their nation. Isaiah, however, contended that the defeat enabled them to take up their real mission, which was bearing the word of God's impartial justice as the basis of world peace. Instead of an empire ruled from Jerusalem with a rod of iron held over her prostrate enemies, he held that the promise of peace brought through the idea of arbitration through the nations might beat their swords into plowshares, and that nation should not lift up sword against nation, that neither should they learn war anymore. Needless to say, after a while, Assyria was in decline, and the Hebrews once again felt strong enough under King Josiah to declare their independence from Assyrian rule, following their ideology based on the idea that Israel would always prevail in battle if it obeyed the cultic laws, if they followed to the letter all the purification laws, that they knew that they would win. Well, once again a prophet arose to speak against the folly of believing that no evil shall come upon us, nor will we see sword or famine. Walking through Jerusalem wearing the yoke of a prisoner of war, Jeremiah warned of the consequences of such beliefs. For this he was imprisoned as a subversive. Jerusalem was sacked and its territory dismembered. When the fundamentalists revolted some 10 years later, the capital was destroyed and the remaining population was deported to Babylon, where we find the psalmists lamenting their situation, wishing evil upon those who now oppress them as they had oppressed others. Is there no end to this cycle? Yet, what of those who truly are evil? What about nations that refuse to abide by international law, common decency to their neighbors? There's been no shortage of modern Babylons, nations like Nazi Germany, nations that went to war with slogans like "God is with us" emblazoned on their belt buckles. It's easy for us to see that this was an evil empire, not only because of its quest to conquer and enslave inferior races, but in its idolatrous worship of its supreme leader, Adolf Hitler. It's easier for us to recognize the evil inherent in their view that they were a righteous nation, favored by God. But it's much harder for us to recognize our own brand of idolatry and worship of the state. It's much harder to see that just as the ancient Hebrews considered themselves to be especially blessed and ordained by God with a mission to rule the world, so do we. It's much harder to see that we are following in their footsteps by refusing to listen to the voices of compassion and understanding, by refusing to support the very institutions that can help to bring some measure of relief from the cycle of violence and pain, by refusing to recognize our complicity in the very evils that lead others to call for retribution and revenge. We set the stage for further bloodshed. Still, in far too many instances, it's our own very sense of religious duty that impels us that we can only be certain destruction, not only for ourselves, but for many others around the world. We must be as wary of overzealous religiosity as we are of anything else, especially if that religiosity calls for blind patriotism or pursuance of national interests above the interests of everyone else in the world. We need to be especially wary of the tendency to see in ourselves all that is great and all that is good, while attributing to the enemy all that is evil. It's never quite as simple as some would have us believe. No, nothing is simple. We must continually be wary of claims the state makes for allegiance, obedience, and service under the guise of patriotism. Such demands are often put in noble or innocent-sounding terms. And yes, we must be continually aware of the power behind the throne, as it were, the power to inflict death rather than the power to enhance life. It isn't always easy to tell the difference either. It's far too easy to fall prey to what has in effect become our civic religion, the idolatry of the idea of America as the New Jerusalem. There's an attitude among many Americans that we are somehow a specially blessed nation above all others. We often conceive ourselves to be granted a special God-given right and destiny to always be supreme forever among the world's people, fancying ourselves to be the ideal nation. Yes, the New Jerusalem. Yet in many ways, America has become the new Babylon in the eyes of oppressed people around the world. The arrogance with which we glory in our military and economic strength, while refusing to recognize its toll, not only upon those outside our borders, but upon those whose backs this nation has been built, has led to a situation in which we have been referred to by some people as the Great Satan. Many around the world actively plot our national downfall, praying for deliverance from yet another Babylon. At this point, it might be useful to read the concluding lines of the psalm with which we began. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, raise it, down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, you devastator. Happy shall be he who requites you with what you have done to us. Happy shall be he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Strong words indeed, which echo a sentiment that lay embedded in the hearts of many of the other Babylon's victims. In fact, this sounds much like the sentiments expressed by many of those that we now brand as terrorists. Am I suggesting that we are an evil nation? No, I'm not. However, I'm suggesting that we must always remain vigilant to hold our nation to its ideals and to keep the memory of that ideal state in our hearts and minds. We must remain vigilant to not allow our nation to follow in the footsteps of Babylon. For in Revelations 18, we are reminded of what ultimately befalls Babylon and any nation that emulates her. We are advised to come out of her, my people. lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her as she herself has rendered, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double draught for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and played the wanton, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, a queen I sit, I am no widow, mourning I shall never see. So shall her plagues come in a single day, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she shall be burned with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who judges her. I pray it's not too late already. Aloha. Amen. Blessed be. Shalom.